The dog hit the ground hard, 70 pounds of muscle and trained instinct slamming into the dirt after a soldier's boot caught it across the ribs. The animal yelped, sharp, ugly, and the training yard went briefly still. Then a woman walked out of the medical bay. She wasn't large. She wasn't armed. She was 31 years old, wearing scrubs with a stethoscope still around her neck, and she crossed that yard like she owned every inch of it. She stopped 3 feet from the soldier who'd kicked the dog. "Do that again," Nurse Evelyn Marsh said quietly, "and I will put you on the ground next to him." The soldiers laughed. They had no idea what she used to be. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, institutions, and events are wholly imaginary. The Kelman Ridge Military Training Compound sat on a flat stretch of land outside Drayport, a mid-sized coastal city in the Pacific Northwest where fog came in most mornings and burned off by noon. The compound was technically a joint-use facility, meaning it housed both active military training units and a contracted medical support staff that operated out of a building everyone called the aid station, though it was closer to a small emergency clinic with better lighting and worse coffee than any hospital Evelyn had worked in before. She had been at Kelman Ridge for 11 weeks. In those 11 weeks, she had learned the following. The vending machine near the locker rooms always ate your dollar on the first try. The base commander, Colonel Douglas Fitch, had a habit of walking the perimeter at 0530 and did not appreciate being spoken to before he had finished his first cup. The military working dog kennel sat at the northeast corner of the compound, and the handler assigned to the program, a lean, quiet veteran named Specialist Rowan Decker, arrived there every morning at 0445, rain or shine, like clockwork. She had also learned that Lieutenant Ryan Colton and most of his unit considered her furniture. Useful furniture, maybe. The kind you moved around when you needed the space. The morning the dog got kicked started like every other morning. Evelyn came out of the aid station at 0615 to get some air before the day's training rotations brought her the usual parade of twisted ankles and bruised egos. She had her coffee. She was watching the fog pull back from the tree line. She was not looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding her on this base. The training yard ran parallel to the kennel, separated by a chain-link fence. That morning, a rotation of infantry trainees was running an obstacle sequence. Walls, crawl nets, the narrow beam crossing. And one of the K9 units had been brought out as part of the demonstration. The dog's name was Breck. He was a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois with a scar running from his left ear down across his muzzle. The result of something that had happened before Decker got him. Something no one talked about. Breck was not the friendliest animal on the compound. He was, however, exceptionally good at his job. Evelyn had been watching Breck work for 2 months. She'd seen him locate a hidden training cache in under 90 seconds, alert on a concealed explosive dummy at 40 meters, and once, during a scenario that went sideways, hold a position on a downed handler while 3 simulated threats tried to get past him. The dog was controlled, precise, and deeply focused. What he was not was a prop. The trainee, she didn't know his name yet, had come off the obstacle wall annoyed. He'd slipped on the wet timber on his 3rd attempt, landed badly, taken a ribbing from his squad. He was hot-faced and embarrassed and apparently decided to take it out on the nearest available target. Breck was being led past the group by Decker when the trainee stepped forward and shoved the dog sideways with his boot. Not a tap, a real shove, with weight behind it. Breck stumbled, hit the ground, yelped. Decker was already moving, already saying something sharp, but what happened next was faster than he could manage. Evelyn set down her coffee on the fence post and walked into the yard. She didn't run. She didn't shout across the distance. She walked, and something about the way she walked made 3 or 4 trainees step back without knowing why they were doing it. She stopped in front of the trainee. He was at least 4 inches taller than her and had the broad-shouldered build of someone who'd been lifting since high school. He was still red-faced from his fall, and he looked at her with the particular expression men sometimes gave her on this base, the one that said, "Who let the nurse out here?" "Touch that dog again," Evelyn said, "and you'll regret it." A beat of silence. Then the laughter started. It came from the group near the wall first, a few guys who'd been watching. Then it spread, the way laughter does when it's less about something actually being funny and more about a group deciding how to respond to something that confused them. A civilian woman in scrubs had just walked into an active training yard and threatened a soldier. That was the joke. The trainee grinned. And what exactly are you going to do about it? Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, not angry, not flustered, just looking at him the way you look at a problem you've already solved. Nothing, she said. Today. But I wrote down your name when you signed into the medical rotation Monday, and I have very good handwriting, and anything I put in your file stays there. So the question isn't what I'm going to do. The question is whether this moment is worth what it costs you. She held his gaze for another 3 seconds, then bent down and checked Breck's ribs with both hands, running her fingers along the animal's side with the quick, efficient movements of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Breck let her. He'd let her before. She'd been treating a minor paw laceration for 2 weeks, and the dog had apparently decided she was acceptable. She straightened up, looked at Decker. He's okay. Might be sore. Watch how he moves this afternoon. Then she picked up her coffee and walked back to the aid station. Behind her, the laughter had stopped. But Lieutenant Ryan Colton had what Evelyn privately considered a very organized set of biases. He was 29, Ranger qualified, had done 2 combat deployments that he referenced in about 40% of his sentences, and operated on the working assumption that anyone without combat experience had no business being at Kelman Ridge. He was not malicious, exactly. She'd met malicious, and Colton wasn't that. He was something she found almost harder to work around. He was genuinely, sincerely convinced that she didn't belong. He showed it in the way he addressed her, always the nurse in group settings. Never by name, even after 11 weeks. He'd walk into the aid station with his guys and make announcements as though she weren't in the room, then turn and add her in like a footnote. He showed it in the way he handled her assessments. 3 weeks in, she had flagged a trainee named Carver for a rotator cuff issue that needed rest. Carver was in Colton's unit, and Colton had appeared in the aid station doorway 20 minutes after she filed the report, not quite demanding she reverse it, but suggesting, very politely, with a pleasant tone that didn't match his eyes, that perhaps she was being overly cautious, given that she hadn't worked in a military environment before. She had looked at his shoulder X-ray request from 6 months prior, sitting on her desk where she'd pulled it to check his history, and said, without looking up, his previous MRI showed early-stage fraying in the supraspinatus. If he runs the rope obstacle with that shoulder this week, he'll tear it. He can rejoin his unit in 3 weeks. Colton had left without another word. Carver thanked her 2 weeks later, quietly, when no one was watching. But the dynamic didn't change. If anything, it calcified. Colton's unit started calling her station, as in aid station, as in the place you went when you scraped a knee. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It was the kind of nickname that tells you exactly where someone stands in the hierarchy. What kept Evelyn functional in those 11 weeks was work. She was good at work, and there was always enough of it. The morning rotations brought her training injuries. The afternoon shifts sometimes included assessments for the K9 handlers, Decker and his 2 junior handlers, Okafor and Perez, because the dogs needed medical attention too, and the installation's veterinary contract was inconsistent. She'd started supplementing. Nobody asked her to. She just did it. Breck, with his scarred face and his careful eyes, had become something she looked forward to seeing. The day after the yard incident, she brought a cold pack for his ribs and sat with him for 20 minutes in the kennel. Decker watched from the doorway with his arms crossed. You know that trainee filed a complaint, he said, claimed you threatened him. I advised him of potential administrative consequences for misconduct. Evelyn ran her hand along Breck's side. The dog pressed into the touch. That's within my scope. Decker made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Colton's using it to push a formal review, says civilian staff overstepping their role. She nodded slowly. She'd expected something like that. Not necessarily this fast, but something. What kind of review? The kind where they decide whether to renew your contract. Evelyn kept her hands moving along Breck's coat. The dog exhaled, long and slow, his head dropping onto her knee. When? End of the week. She absorbed that. 11 weeks in, The contract ran through 10 more months. A non-renewal at this stage would mean a lot of explaining to any future employer, and the kind of explanation that was hard to make sound good without getting into the details she wasn't cleared to discuss. "Okay," she said. Decker looked at her. "That's it? Okay?" "I'll go to the review. I'll answer the questions. We'll see." He studied her for a long moment. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that. You don't look worried." Evelyn finally looked up at him. "I've been in situations where the thing in front of me was the least dangerous thing in the room. This isn't even close to that." Decker was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that story going to stay classified forever, or do you eventually tell people?" She smiled at him, the first real smile she'd managed in a week. "Probably forever." The formal review happened on a Thursday in a conference room in the administrative building. It was Colton, a personnel officer named Major Lynette Strand, and Colonel Fitch, who sat at the head of the table and looked like he'd rather be walking the perimeter. Strand read the complaint into the record. Threatening a trainee, interfering with a training exercise, overstepping civilian medical scope to engage with military working dog operations without authorization. Evelyn sat with her hands flat on the table and listened. When Strand finished, Fitch looked at her. "Do you want to respond to these?" "Yes, sir." She'd thought about how to do this, and she'd decided to be direct because anything else would take longer. The incident in the training yard involved a working military dog being physically struck by a trainee in a non-training context. I stepped in to prevent a second strike and to assess the animal for injury. That's not outside my scope. Specialist Decker and I have an informal protocol because the veterinary coverage here is inconsistent. The record shows that. "Informal protocol," Strand said carefully. "Yes. Undocumented. I'll accept that criticism." Colton leaned forward slightly. He had that careful, pleasant tone again, the one that didn't match his eyes. "Nurse Marsh, I think what concerns me is the pattern, the Carver situation. Now this. You have a tendency to engage beyond the parameters of your position, and I think that's worth examining honestly. The Carver situation resulted in an avoided surgical intervention. The report I filed was accurate. That may be true, but the manner— Lieutenant?" Fitch cut him off. Not loudly, just with finality. The room went quiet. Fitch tapped the folder in front of him. "Nurse Marsh, I've read your contract file. There are some elements of your background that are not available in standard personnel review." He said this without inflection, without looking at Colton. "What I can say is that your 11 weeks here reflect a measurable contribution to this unit's medical outcomes, and that the complaint filed against you has no corroboration from either Specialist Decker or any of the 3 trainees who witnessed the incident." Strand blinked. "Colonel, 3 trainees submitted statements saying they observed Nurse Marsh provide first aid to the working dog after it fell in the yard. None of them reported a threat." Colton's jaw went tight. Evelyn kept her face neutral. She had not known about the statements. She filed that away. Fitch closed the folder. "The review finds no grounds for contract action. We're done." He looked directly at Colton for a beat that lasted long enough to mean something. "We're done, Lieutenant." Colton stood when Fitch did, because you stood when the Colonel stood. But his eyes moved to Evelyn for just a moment, and they said clearly, without words, "This isn't over." She believed him. The classified file Colonel Fitch had referenced sat behind a wall that required 2 separate security clearances and a supervisor approval process that Evelyn had never tried to push. She'd kept it that way on purpose. The summary, had anyone been able to read it, was approximately 11 pages. It covered 4 years of service attached to an irregular operations unit, 3 combat rotations, 2 commendations that were themselves classified, a medical citation for actions taken during an exfiltration under fire in which he had stabilized a critical casualty and extracted him across open ground under sustained small arms contact, which was the kind of sentence that read very calmly on paper and felt very different in a body. She had left the service voluntarily. The reasons were complicated and personal and not something she discussed. What she'd done afterward was take civilian work because she was good at it, and because working on a military-adjacent installation at Kelman Ridge felt, in some way she hadn't fully articulated, like something she wasn't ready to step away from yet. She was not supposed to be the most capable person at Kelman Ridge. She was just supposed to run the aid station. The problem, and she'd known this going in, was that she couldn't actually make herself smaller than she was. She could be quiet. She could stay in her lane. But when there was a problem she could solve and no one else was solving it, she solved it. That was just how she was built. The week after the review, she started formally documenting her work with the K9 unit. She got a written protocol drafted with Decker's input and submitted it to Strand for official incorporation into her contract scope. Strand approved it with what looked like relief. She was, Evelyn suspected, tired of ambiguity. Colton stopped speaking to her directly after that. He routed everything through his sergeant, a solid-looking staff sergeant named Ortega, who had the air of someone who did not personally endorse his officer's position, but was not about to say so out loud. Ortega was professional. He passed information correctly. He once, when Colton was out of earshot, thanked her for the Carver call. Breck's ribs healed. He started tracking her when she entered the kennel area. Not aggressive, just watchful, the way he tracked things he'd decided mattered. Decker noticed. He doesn't do that with people he's just tolerating. I know, she said. He did it with me for about 6 months before he'd let me actually touch him without checking first. I have some advantages with animals. She didn't elaborate. She'd found over the years that the less she explained, the less people pushed for explanations that would unravel into conversations she didn't want to have. The week settled into a rhythm. November came, brought shorter days and harder rain. The training rotations shifted to indoor scenarios. Evelyn adjusted the aid station's stock, pulled additional cold weather injury protocols, started running a weekly brief for the junior handlers on canine cold exposure because Decker told her 2 of his dogs had shown symptoms the previous winter, and nobody had caught it fast enough. She was building something, even if she wasn't supposed to be. She was becoming, slowly and without permission, essential. It was a Tuesday in late November when the first message came through on the emergency coordination channel. Evelyn was in the aid station restocking the suture supplies when she heard the alert tone from the duty room. She walked to the doorway and saw Specialist Okafor standing at the desk, face tight, headset on. Copy that, yes. What's the count? A pause. Confirm that. 5? He looked at her when he said it, which told her something. She crossed the room and stood beside him. He angled the duty screen so she could see it. The situation report was fragmentary, the way they always were in the first hour. A civilian extraction scenario had gone hot. That was the language they used, gone hot, which meant it had transitioned from controlled to actively dangerous. 5 civilians were unaccounted for and believed to be in a location that had been classified as inaccessible. The broad outlines were there, a hostage situation, an enclosed position, a deadline. She read it twice, fast. The location flagged in the report was 1,200 miles away. This wasn't a Kelman Ridge operation, but the personnel being mobilized for response assessment, listed in the routing at the bottom of the report, included the senior command staff of 3 adjacent installations, and one name near the bottom was a director-level defense executive whose name she recognized. Director Calvin Drake. She'd never met Drake. She knew his name from 2 separate briefings in her previous career, both times in contexts that had left a specific taste in her mouth. He was the kind of name that appeared in official channels and disappeared from outcomes, the kind of bureaucratic weight that could speed things up or slow them down, depending on what served him at a given moment. She looked at the deadline in the situation report. 72 hours. Who authorized the initial response team? She asked Okafor. He checked the screen. It's still pending. There's a flag on the routing. Higher level sign-off required before tactical assets can be allocated. How long has that flag been there? He scrolled, checked the timestamp. 14 hours. She didn't say anything. She stood there looking at the screen, at the names, at the timestamp, and something in her chest did a slow, specific rotation. The kind that happened when she recognized a pattern she'd seen before and wished she hadn't. Someone was stalling. She didn't know why yet. She didn't have enough information. But 14 hours of a flag sitting on a response authorization for 5 civilians in a hot location, and that flag in the routing orbit of a name she already didn't trust, that wasn't a coincidence she was willing to explain away. She stepped back from the desk. Log that I reviewed this report, she said to Okafor. Timestamp it. He looked at her with something she couldn't quite read. Caution, maybe, or the early version of understanding. Yes, ma'am. She walked back to the suture supplies and didn't touch them. She stood there in the quiet of the aid station with the rain coming down outside, and she thought about 5 people in a room somewhere, and a deadline that was already 14 hours shorter than it should have been, and a name on a routing list that didn't belong there for any reason she could think of that she liked. 72 hours. Minus 14. 58 hours left. And nobody in the authorized chain was moving. She gave it an hour. That was how long she allowed herself to stand back, to assume that someone in the proper chain of command was reading the same timestamp she'd read and asking the same question. An hour was generous. An hour was more than the situation deserved. But she'd learned in her previous life that the fastest way to become the problem in a room was to move before you were certain the room wasn't already solving it. At the 58-minute mark, she went back to the duty desk. Okafor was still there. He'd been relieved by Perez at the top of the hour, but he hadn't left. He was sitting in the chair beside the duty station with his jacket still on, watching the screen. Same flag? She asked. Same flag. She pulled up the full routing log on the secondary terminal. It took her 4 minutes to trace the approval chain, who had sign-off authority, who had been notified, what the response had been. What she found was not chaos. Chaos she could work with. Chaos had an energy to it, a forward motion even when it was directionless. What she found was silence. The authorization request had been received by 3 separate offices. 2 of them had sent acknowledgement receipts, automated, the kind of response that confirmed delivery without confirming that anyone had actually looked at it. The 3rd office, the one with actual release authority over tactical assets, had not responded at all. That office routed through Director Calvin Drake's command structure. She printed the log, all 12 pages of it. She folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she walked across the compound in the rain to find Colonel Fitch. He was in his office, which surprised her slightly. She'd half expected to find him already in a coordination meeting, already aware, already moving. But he was at his desk with reading glasses on, working through what looked like budget requisitions, and when she knocked on the open door, he looked up with the expression of a man who had not been informed of anything requiring urgent attention. That told her something she didn't want to know. Nurse Marsh. He set the requisitions down. What is it? She put the printed log on his desk. The situation report on the Delta 7 extraction. The authorization flag has been sitting for just under 16 hours now. Drake's office is the hold point. Fitch looked at the log. He didn't pick it up immediately, which meant he was processing before he reacted, which she respected. Then he lifted it, read the first 2 pages, and his expression did something controlled and unreadable. Where did you get routing access? Okafor pulled the duty screen for me when the alert came through. The full routing log is accessible to medical staff for coordination purposes during emergency classification events. I checked. You checked? Before I looked at it, yes. He set the log down, looked at her over the glasses. You came to me directly. Not to Strand, not to the personnel channel. You're the installation commander, and the flag is 14, now 16, hours old, Colonel. There are 5 civilians in that location. One of them is a child. The last word sat in the room. Fitch took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, a gesture she'd never seen him make before. I'm aware of the situation, Nurse Marsh. The channels are sitting on it. The channels have reasons I'm not at liberty to discuss at your clearance level. She'd prepared for this. I'm not asking for the operational details, sir. I'm asking whether someone with decision authority has been made aware that the flag is originating from Drake's office and that the timeline is now below 60 hours. A pause. Long enough that she understood he hadn't known about Drake's office specifically. Leave the log, he said. Yes, sir. She left. She was halfway back to the aid station when she heard him pick up his phone. What happened in the next 6 hours was the kind of institutional movement that looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. No announcements, no visible change in activity on the compound. The training rotations ran as scheduled. Ortega's squad did their afternoon PT in the yard. Decker worked Breck through a tracking drill in the north field. But Evelyn, who had learned to read the texture of a base the way you read weather, not by looking directly at it, but by watching what it did to everything else, felt the shift. Strand appeared in the aid station doorway at 1600 hours and asked, carefully, whether Evelyn's emergency coordination protocol access had been formally documented in her contract file. Evelyn told her it had. Strand nodded and left without elaborating. At 1730, Fitch's aide came by with a request for Evelyn to compile a summary of K9 medical readiness for the current compound roster, all 6 dogs, current health status, any active limitations. She compiled it in 40 minutes and sent it back. The request hadn't come through normal channels. It had come directly from Fitch's office. At 1900, she heard from Decker. He found her in the kennel, which had become a kind of neutral ground between them, the place they talked when the conversation needed to stay off the official record without being actively hidden. Fitch made calls, Decker said. He was sitting on a hay bale, not looking at her, doing that thing he did where he spoke to the middle distance when the content was sensitive. I don't know who, but 2 people from the regional coordination office showed up this afternoon and went directly to his office. They were there for 90 minutes. I know. She'd seen the vehicles. Whatever it is you saw in that routing log. He stopped. Started again. You understand that if this goes sideways, you're the easiest person to cut loose. I'm a contracted civilian with a classified background and no institutional protection. Yes, I understand. That doesn't seem to bother you. It bothers me. It just doesn't change what I'm going to do. Breck came over and put his head against her knee. She put her hand on his neck automatically, without looking down. Decker watched her. What are you going to do? Right now? Finish checking Breck's weight. He's dropped almost a pound since last week, and I want to know if it's dietary or stress response. She looked up. After that, I'm going to find out why Drake's office hasn't moved in 16 hours, and I'm going to make sure the right people have that information. And how are you going to do that if you don't have access to Drake's operational space? I don't need access to his operational space. I need access to the people he's been talking to. She paused. Or more specifically, the people he hasn't been talking to. The clearance she needed was 2 levels above her current civilian access. She had the underlying security record to support it. It was sitting in that classified file behind the double-locked wall. But she hadn't activated it since leaving the service, and reactivating it was not a 30-minute process. It required a formal request, a review, and a sign-off from the Defense Intelligence Security Registry, which was exactly the kind of apparatus that moved on its own schedule regardless of what was happening in the field. Unless someone with existing registry authority sponsored the reactivation as an emergency adjunct. There was exactly one person at Kelman Ridge who had that authority. Colonel Douglas Fitch. She wrote the request herself late that night at the aid station desk with the compound quiet around her. She wrote it carefully the way she'd been trained to write operational requests, specific, referenced with the actionable outcomes stated in the first paragraph and the supporting context laid out after. She cited the timeline. She cited the routing log. She cited her prior service record by its classification reference number without specifying its contents, which was the correct way to handle it. She submitted it at 23:17 hours and went to lie down on the aid station cot. She did not expect to sleep. She slept for 4 hours, which was more than she'd expected. The approval came back at 04:12. What the registry access unlocked was not dramatic. It wasn't a database full of obvious wrongdoing. It was a thread, the kind you pulled at, carefully, knowing that if you pulled wrong, you'd lose it. She pulled it right. The thread started with the authorization flag she already knew about, but now, with the elevated access, she could see not just that the flag existed, but the metadata around it. When it had been internally processed inside Drake's office structure, who had seen it, what action tags had been applied. The flag had been seen by Drake's deputy within 2 hours of origination. An action tag had been applied. Pending strategic review. Pending strategic review was a legitimate tag. It was used when a request required analysis against broader operational context before authorization. It was not supposed to sit for 16 hours without a secondary communication. The protocol was 4 hours maximum before either an approval, a denial, or an escalation memo. Drake's office had done none of those things. They had applied the tag and gone quiet. She dug into the strategic context around the extraction scenario. What she found, assembling it from 3 separate information sources that required the elevated access to correlate, was a procurement thread that had nothing obvious to do with a hostage situation and everything to do with why someone might not want one resolved quickly. The location where the 5 civilians were being held, a compound that had been characterized in the initial situation report as a hardened position controlled by hostile actors, was connected through 2 intermediate layers to a private security contracting network. That network held current contracts with the same defense procurement office that Drake oversaw. She sat with that for a long time. What it meant, if the connection was real, was that the people holding the hostages were, not directly, not cleanly, but functionally, operating inside a network that Drake's office had financial exposure to. If the extraction went forward through standard channels, it would generate a full incident report. The report would map the location, the actors, the network. That map would eventually reach contract review, and Drake's office would be in that map. A rescue mission wasn't just a rescue mission. It was the beginning of an audit. She printed what she had, labeled it carefully, put it in a second folder, separate from the routing log. Then she sat in the aid station in the dark and thought about whether she was right. She thought about it seriously, the way she'd been trained to, looked for alternative explanations, tested the logic, tried to find the version where Drake's behavior was explained by something less damaging. She found a few possible alternatives. She couldn't rule them out. She didn't have enough certainty to be certain, but she had enough to put it in front of someone who could act on it. The question was who? Fitch had already been helpful, and she trusted him within the limits of his position. But what she had now wasn't a routing anomaly she could hand to the installation commander. It was a procurement corruption thread that, if she was right, implicated a director-level defense executive in deliberate obstruction of a rescue operation. That was not a Fitch-level problem. That was a federal problem. She needed someone who sat outside Drake's authority structure entirely. She found the name she was looking for at 0530 in a personnel directory that the elevated access let her reach. She verified it twice because the last thing she could afford was to contact the wrong person or to contact the right person through the wrong channel. Colonel Miriam Tao was the current senior officer of the Defense Criminal Investigative Command's Pacific Regional Office. She was not in Drake's reporting structure. She was not in anyone at Kelman Ridge's reporting structure. She was, as far as Evelyn could determine, the appropriate point of contact for what she had. Getting to Tao directly, without routing through Drake's sphere of influence, meant not using the standard contact channels. She needed a direct line. She spent 40 minutes finding it. At 0613, she sent a secure message to an address she'd located through 2 separate registry nodes. The message was brief. It identified herself by name, rank equivalent, and the classification reference for her service record. It stated that she had time-sensitive information relevant to an ongoing extraction delay that she believed constituted deliberate obstruction by a named executive officer. It requested contact within 4 hours given the active timeline. She sent it and put the terminal to sleep. Outside, the compound was starting to wake up. She could hear the distant noise of the early PT formation starting. The rain had stopped overnight and the morning was gray and still, the kind of quiet that could go either way. She was halfway through making coffee when Colton's voice came from the aid station doorway. "Marsh." She turned. He was in PT gear, which meant he'd been in the yard, which meant he'd come here specifically rather than passing by. "Lieutenant." He stepped inside. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his expression was the one she'd never quite figured out how to read. Not the careful, pleasant tone, not the dismissive neutrality. Something more direct than either. "Fitch told me he authorized an emergency clearance upgrade for you last night." She waited. "He didn't tell me why." Colton looked around the aid station, at the equipment, the cot, the stack of folders on the desk. "I'm assuming it connects to the Delta 7 flag." "That's between me and Colonel Fitch." "I know." He nodded slowly. "I'm not here to—" He stopped, seemed to reorganize what he was about to say. "I pulled Decker's statement from last month, the one he gave during your review. All 3 of the trainee statements came because he contacted them directly and made sure they knew what was being asked. She hadn't known that." "He did that on his own," Colton said. "Yes." which means he thought you were worth protecting. Decker's a good judge of character. Colton looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, some adjustment she couldn't fully see. I owe you an honest question. You can ask. The Delta 7 civilians. You think someone is keeping that flag up deliberately? She considered how to answer that. I think there's information that would be useful to the people making that determination, and I think I have some of it. That's not a no. No, she said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment, then he nodded again, the kind of nod that didn't mean agreement so much as a decision being made. If there's anything I can do inside my authority that helps move this, he stopped again. This clearly wasn't easy for him. You have my number. He left before she could respond. She stood there holding her coffee and thought about that, about what it cost him to walk in here and say that, and decided it was the most human thing he'd done in the time she'd known him. Colonel Tao's response came at 0941. It was 4 lines. It confirmed receipt. It confirmed Tao's identity through a verification protocol Evelyn had included in her message. It requested a secure voice call at 1100 hours, and it included a contact bridge number that routed through the investigative office's own encrypted channel. Evelyn spent the time until 1100 organizing what she had. She separated it into 2 categories: what she knew with documented certainty and what she assessed with reasonable support but couldn't prove independently. She labeled them clearly. That separation mattered. She'd been in enough briefings where certainty and assessment got blurred together and created a mess that took twice as long to untangle as it would have taken to just get it right the first time. At 1058, she locked the aid station door, sat at the secure terminal, and dialed the bridge number. Tao's voice was even and unhurried and completely impossible to read emotionally, which Evelyn found reassuring. She'd worked with officers who performed control. This felt like the real thing. Nurse Marsh, tell me what you have. She walked through it in order: the timeline, the flag, the routing, the metadata from the registry access, the procurement thread, the connection between Drake's contracting network and the location. She spoke for 11 minutes without being interrupted. When she finished, Tao was quiet for a moment. You said the connection runs through 2 intermediate layers. Yes, it's not direct, but the intermediaries are documented. How confident are you in the procurement thread specifically? 60 to 70%. It's correlative, not causal. I could be reading a coincidence. But you don't think so? No. But I think you should verify it independently before acting on my read. Another pause. That's an unusually careful answer from someone who clearly has a stake in being believed. I'd rather you verify it and find out I'm right than act on it and find out I was wrong. If I'm wrong, 5 people still need to be extracted, and the problem is just in the authorization channel, which is fixable. If I'm right, they need to be extracted, and something needs to happen to Drake's office, and one of those has to come before the other. The extraction first. Yes. Tao's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but with something behind it that hadn't been there before. I'm going to tell you that I've seen the flag. My office monitors high-priority extraction delays automatically. We flagged this yesterday morning. Evelyn felt something in her chest go very still. Why haven't you moved on it? She asked. Then immediately, I'm sorry, you don't have to answer that. No, it's a fair question. A pause. Because until I received your message, I had correlative evidence but not documented sourcing on the Drake connection. You just gave me the sourcing. The stillness in her chest turned into something else. Something that she recognized as the particular feeling of a door opening that had been locked long enough that she'd stopped expecting it to move. What do you need from me? She said. Stay available. Don't share what you found outside of Fitch and the documentation you've already secured. And Nurse Marsh, yes. The timeline you're working from. You said below 60 hours when you started this. She checked the clock on the wall. 43 hours now, she said. Then we don't have much room to move slowly. There was the sound of something being moved on Tao's end, papers or a keyboard. I have people who can move fast, but I need the extraction to run concurrently, because the moment Drake's office gets any signal that my office is looking at them, they'll push that flag forward and authorize the mission to create the appearance of clean behavior, which means I need the tactical piece in motion before the investigative piece becomes visible. Evelyn understood the logic immediately. You need a response unit that can activate without going through Drake's authorization chain. Correct? There's nothing at Kelman Ridge that qualifies. The tactical units here route through regional command, which touches Drake's office. I know. Which means you're looking for assets outside the standard structure. Which means I'm asking whether you know of any. The question sat in the room. She did in fact know of one possibility. It was not a clean option. It was not a well-resourced option. It was the kind of option that worked when nothing else was available and would get laughed out of any formal planning room. She had 11 weeks of data on every handler, every dog, and every marginally available operator attached to Kelman Ridge who wasn't inside a standard chain of command. She had medical records. She had training performance logs. She had Decker, who was the best handler she'd ever watched work, and 2 junior handlers who were better than their unofficial status suggested. She had Breck and 5 other dogs. And she had Colton's phone number in her pocket, and his voice 20 minutes ago saying if there's anything I can do. I might have something, she said. Tell me. She told her. When she finished, Tao was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make her wonder if she'd misjudged. Then, that's an irregular team. Yes. The dogs are the part of this that would usually disqualify it entirely.
The
dogs are the part of this that makes it work where standard assets won't. The location in the situation report, the structural configuration of that compound, it's not optimized for electronic surveillance. The reports have been consistent about that. Thermal is inconsistent, signal is jammed, camera placement is blocked by the external wall design. She paused. You can't replace what a trained dog does in that environment. You can't replicate it. You can suppress it or argue about it or write it out of the budget. But in a position where your technology is degraded, the animal is not. Another pause. Can you have a full team readiness summary on my secure line by 1800? Yes. Then do that. A beat. And Nurse Marsh. The summary should include you. Evelyn blinked. I'm a contracted medical nurse. Your registry file is not a contracted medical nurse's file. We both know that. And if this unit deploys, it needs its own medical capability that sits outside the standard medevac chain because the standard medevac chain runs through Drake's structure. She absorbed that. Yes, it does. So the summary includes you. She stood at the window. The compound was midday quiet, a few figures moving between buildings, Decker's truck visible at the north edge near the kennel. All right, she said. I'll be in contact. The line closed. She stood there for a moment, looking at nothing in particular, letting the scale of what she'd just agreed to settle in her. Then she picked up her phone and sent a single text to Colton's number. Need to meet, K9 building, 1400. His response came back in under a minute. On my way. She looked at the clock. 42 hours and change. She started writing. The readiness summary took her until 1730. She sent it at 1743. What had happened between 1400 and 1743 was the most unconventional planning session she had been part of since the last time she'd been in a room where everything was unconventional. Colton had arrived at the kennel exactly at 1400, which she'd expected, and he'd listened to the broad outlines of what she was asking without interrupting, which she hadn't. When she finished, he looked at the dogs for a long time. You're asking me to put together a unit that has no official activation authority, he said. Tao's office can provide the authorization. It just can't go through the standard chain. Because the standard chain, yes. He ran his hand over his jaw. How many operators are we talking about? I need 6 to 8. People who can move fast, work in close terrain, and have some tolerance for operating without a complete picture. I have 3 in my unit who aren't currently assigned to anything that touches regional command. Ortega? Colton looked at her sideways. Yeah, Ortega. He's good. I want him. You want him. Something like a reluctant smile, there and gone. You've been here 11 weeks. I've been watching for 11 weeks. There's a difference. He didn't argue that. He spent 20 minutes going through names, and she listened, and twice she pushed back on someone he suggested because her medical records showed something disqualifying. And once she suggested someone he hadn't thought of, a handler attachment named Vasquez, who'd been flagged as a poor fit for standard operations, but whose record showed very specific skills in low-light, close terrain that were directly relevant. Decker said yes before she finished asking. Okafor and Perez said yes inside 30 seconds of each other. The unit took shape: 8 operators, 3 handlers, 6 dogs, and Evelyn. Not large enough to overwhelm anything, specific enough to do the one thing the situation needed. She wrote all of it into the summary and sent it to Tao's line. The response came at 1812. Authorization package being prepared. Staging brief at 0600 tomorrow. Stand by for location. She read it twice. Then she walked to the kennel and sat with Breck in the dark for a while. The dog put his head in her lap and she scratched behind his scarred ear and didn't think about anything in particular, which was the most honest thing she'd done all day. She was still sitting there when Decker appeared in the kennel doorway, silhouetted. "He likes you," Decker said. "I know." "He doesn't like most people." "I know." A pause. "You've done this before. Whatever this is." She didn't answer immediately. Breck breathed steadily against her legs. "Yes," she finally said. "Was it like this?" She thought about that honestly. It was worse, but there were more resources. So in some ways it was easier. She looked up at him. "This one is going to depend entirely on whether we execute it right, because there's no margin, no backup. If we go in short and something goes wrong, then we fix it in the field." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked into the kennel and sat down on the other side of Breck. And the dog didn't move, just shifted slightly to accommodate both of them. "Oh, 600 brief?" Decker said. "Probably." He nodded, reached over and scratched Breck's other ear. They sat like that in the dark of the kennel while the compound settled into night, and Evelyn ran the numbers again in her head. The timeline, the team, the route, the things that could go wrong, and found 17 separate points of potential failure, which she filed away in sequence so that when one of them happened, she'd already know what to do next. 41 hours. She was almost ready. Then her phone buzzed. The text was from the secure bridge number Tao's office had used. It was 3 words. Drake just moved. She stared at it. Not an authorization. The word authorization wasn't there. Not an approval of the rescue mission. Drake had moved, which could mean a dozen things, most of them bad. She called the bridge number. Tao picked up on the second ring. "Tell me," Evelyn said. "He's filed a preemptive obstruction complaint. Named you specifically. He says a civilian staff member at Kelman Ridge has been accessing classified coordination materials without proper authority and attempting to coordinate unauthorized tactical activity through back channels." The air in the kennel felt very still. "He knows," Evelyn said. "He knows something. We don't know how much." "If he's filed the complaint, he's going to push it through Fitch's office." "Yes. And if Fitch is ordered to stand down any non-standard activity on the compound, he has to comply," Evelyn said. "He can't protect this operation if there's a formal complaint." "No, he can't." She looked at Breck. The dog was watching her now, his amber eyes still in the dim light, reading something in her face that he couldn't name but understood. "How long do we have before the complaint reaches Fitch?" she asked. Tao's answer was not what she wanted to hear. "It already did. 40 minutes ago." 40 minutes. She did the math without meaning to, the way her brain had always processed gaps between events. Automatically, the numbers arriving before the decision. If the complaint had reached Fitch 40 minutes ago, he'd had time to read it, time to make a call, possibly time to receive instruction. The only reason she hadn't seen the result of that yet was that he was a careful man who thought before he moved. But careful had limits when a director-level executive filed a formal obstruction complaint. "I need to know if Fitch has been ordered to take action," she said. "I don't have visibility into what he's received," Tao said. "My jurisdiction is the investigative thread. The personnel action against you is separate from—" "I understand." She was already standing, already moving toward the kennel door. "I need 10 minutes. Marsh," Tao's voice sharpened slightly. "If you go to Fitch right now, and he's been ordered to stand you down, you put him in a position where he has to choose between a federal obstruction investigation and a direct order from above his pay grade." "I know. That's not a fair position to put him in." No, she said. It's not. She stopped at the door. Breck was on his feet behind her. But the alternative is I wait in the dark and hope someone in the right office does the right thing before the timeline runs out, and I've been watching that approach fail for 47 hours. A pause. Then, be careful. She pocketed the phone and looked back at Decker. He was already on his feet. How bad? He said. Bad enough. She grabbed her jacket. Wake up Okafor and Perez. Don't brief them. Not yet. Just make sure they're not asleep. And get the dogs ready for a health check. A health check. In case anyone asks what we're doing in the kennel at 2100 hours. He understood. On it. She crossed the compound at a walk. Running drew attention. Walking in the dark between buildings was invisible. Fitch's office light was on. He was alone, which was the first good sign. The second was that he looked at her when she walked in without reaching for the phone, which meant he wasn't in active instruction from above. She closed the door behind her. You already know, she said. Drake's complaint came through the secure flag at 1935. He leaned back in his chair. His face was doing the controlled, unreadable thing, but his hands were flat on the desk with more deliberate stillness than usual. He's claiming unauthorized access to restricted coordination channels and unauthorized assembly of tactical assets. He named you. He's not wrong about the access, technically. He is wrong about the authorization. Colonel Tao's office issued emergency adjunct status, which predates any complaint Drake filed. Fitch looked at her for a long moment. You've already been talking to Tao. Since 0941 this morning. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. You went over my head. I went around a structure that Drake has leverage over. That includes most of the regional command layer, and with respect, sir, it includes you. Not because of anything you've done, but because you can be ordered by people he has relationships with. Tao's office can't be ordered by Drake or anyone Drake has access to. That's a very precise read of the command structure. I've had practice. He was quiet. She let the quiet sit because pushing him would be wrong. Fitch was not the problem. He was also not quite the solution. He occupied a careful, narrow space, and she needed him to stay in it. Drake is pushing for immediate suspension of any non-standard activity on this installation, Fitch said. If I receive a formal order to enforce that, you enforce it. I know. She stepped forward and put both folders on his desk, the routing log and the procurement thread. I need you to do one thing before that order comes through. He looked at the folders, didn't touch them. Those go to Tao's office, she said. Not to regional command, not through Drake's structure. Directly to Tao. If you transmit them under your authorization as installation commander, they carry documented chain of custody that my access alone doesn't provide. He stared at the folders. It's not a violation of any order you've received, she said. You haven't been ordered yet. You're transmitting documentation to a federal investigative officer. That's within your authority. You have the timing on this very precise. Yes. Because once I send it, Drake can still file whatever he wants to file. But Tao's office has documented sourcing, and the extraction has a cleaner path forward. She paused. The authorization from Tao's end for our unit is already drafted. It just needs to transmit without Drake being able to pull it back. And the way to make that happen is to give Tao's investigation enough documented weight that any interference with the operation becomes its own evidence. Fitch picked up the routing log. Read it. Set it down. Picked up the procurement thread. She stood and watched him read. His expression didn't change. He was a man who had spent a long time learning not to show things in his face, and he was very good at it. But she watched his hands, and his hands told her what she needed to know. He understood what he was looking at. He set the folder down. If I'm wrong about what this is, then you transmitted routine documentation to a federal investigative officer and nothing happens. If you're right about what it is, 5 people come home. He looked at her, just looked at her, long enough that she wondered what he was seeing. Then he picked up the secure line on his desk and dialed. The brief happened at 0330 instead of 0600 because the timeline had compressed and because waiting until 0600 meant losing another 3 hours, and 3 hours in a 41-hour window was not something any of them could justify. Tao's authorization came through at 0142. A clean document, properly formatted, bearing the DCIC seal and Tao's direct signature. The moment it arrived, Drake's complaint lost its ability to stop the operation. It could still create consequences afterward. It would. But it couldn't pull the unit off the mission before it went. They gathered in the kennel because the kennel had no external-facing windows, and Decker had a standing access log reason for activity at any hour. 8 operators, 3 handlers, 6 dogs. And Evelyn, standing at the front of the room with a map she'd printed at 0100 and a very clear idea of how many things could go wrong. The compound in the situation report was located in an isolated river canyon territory, privately held land that had been systematically cleared of all official presence over 18 months. The hostages were believed to be in the central structure, a converted agricultural building that had been reinforced with added barriers at all ground-level access points. Satellite imaging showed no reliable entry from the south or east approaches. The north approach crossed a quarter-mile of cleared ground that provided zero concealment. The west approach crossed a drainage ravine and came up through the compound's utility corridor. It was the worst path on paper. No roads, no clear sight lines, 3 known obstacles, and terrain that would slow any vehicle down to useless. It was also the only approach that the compound's external security pattern didn't cover with regular sweeps. The dogs run point on the west corridor, she said. Not because it's comfortable, because we don't know what's in that corridor that the satellites couldn't see, and the dogs will find it before we step on it. Colton was against the wall with his arms crossed. He hadn't argued anything she'd said yet. She was not sure if that was agreement or assessment. Ortega raised his hand. What are we thinking for the internal search? Breck runs the primary search pattern inside the main structure. Okafor keeps him tight. No free range, structured grid. We're looking for 5 people in a building where someone has actively tried to make them hard to find. The structural imaging suggests 2 subfloor spaces. Breck will tell us which one faster than we can find it manually. And if the building is rigged? Vasquez asked. She was leaning forward with both forearms on her knees, and she asked the question the way someone asks something they already know matters. That's the same answer. The dogs flag it first. If we get a hard alert on the entry, we stop and we go wide. We have no disposal assets. No, so we go wide. She met Vasquez's eyes. That's not a satisfying answer. It's the accurate one. Vasquez nodded, accepted it. She went through the medical protocol next. Triage priority, extraction sequence, which operators had enough field medicine training to hold a position with a casualty while she dealt with another one. She didn't sugarcoat the resource gap. They had 2 trauma kits and her field bag, and whatever each operator carried on their individual kit. If they came out with more than 2 critical casualties simultaneously, they would be improvising. The child, she said, and the room got quieter. If the child requires medical intervention, she goes first. Every operator understands that? Nobody argued. They moved out at 0445. The west corridor was worse than the map suggested, which meant it was exactly as bad as she'd expected, which meant it was very bad. The drainage ravine was running with 2 feet of cold water from the previous night's rain. Getting the dogs across without contaminating their scent tracking required 10 minutes they didn't have, and careful handling that Decker and his team managed with the practiced calm of people who had done hard things quietly before. Breck crossed last, swam it in 4 strokes, shook out on the far bank, and immediately put his nose down and moved. The corridor beyond the ravine was 40 meters of compressed, brush-tangled terrain between the ravine bank and the compound's utility perimeter. It smelled of chemical runoff and old machinery. The ground was soft in places that looked solid from a step away, and twice the lead operators sank ankle-deep before adjusting their path. Breck found the first problem at 23 meters. He stopped, planted. His head went very still. Evelyn, moving third in the column, felt the stillness ripple backward through the team the way it did. The animal stopping, the handler stopping, the first operator stopping, and the message traveling by proximity and silence. Decker crouched beside Breck, spent 8 seconds looking at what the dog was looking at. Then he raised 1 finger and made a downward gesture. 1 contact, ground level. She moved up to Decker's position. He leaned close. Trip wire. Low set, 7 inches. He's got 2. She looked. Didn't move any body part except her eyes. She could see the wire now, thin as fishing line in the low pre-dawn light. A pressure-sensitive setup, not complex, not professional. The kind of thing someone built from instructions rather than training. Which meant it probably worked. They spent 11 minutes going around it through a route that added 15 meters and a mud bank. 11 minutes out of a timeline that was already drawn tight as a wire itself. The second wire was at 38 meters. They found it because Breck found it. When they cleared the utility perimeter and reached the shadow of the compound's outer wall, Evelyn checked her watch. 40 minutes ahead of the window she'd built in the plan. The wires had eaten most of it. They had 12 minutes to locate the entry point, make contact, and move. Colton came up beside her. "Entry's your call." She looked at the wall. The utility corridor opened onto a maintenance access. A heavy door with a mechanical lock, no electronic component. The lock itself was 12 years old. She knew that from the property assessment she'd sourced, which had been filed for an unrelated inspection before the compound changed hands. She nodded to Vasquez. Vasquez had the door open in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Inside was darkness and the smell of chemicals and something underneath it that she recognized before her brain had fully named it. The unmistakable combination of bodies, sweat, and the particular metabolic signature of people who had not moved enough in a confined space. People were here. Breck knew it too. His posture shifted. Not alert, not alarmed, but locked in on something specific. His whole body reorganizing around a scent trail that he pulled into his system and resolved into a direction. He moved left. Decker followed him. Okafor on the other side. The team spread into the building by quadrant, silent, and Evelyn stayed close to Breck's path because wherever he went was where she needed to be. He led them past a machinery bay, through a narrow corridor with rusted shelving on both sides, around a corner that opened into a larger space, what might have been a processing floor at some point, with a ceiling high enough to be cold. He stopped at a floor hatch, sat. One of the operators opened it, a ladder. Darkness below. And then a sound. Small, involuntary, quickly suppressed, that Evelyn felt in her sternum before she understood it with her brain. A child, trying not to make noise. She went down the ladder first before anyone could argue about it, because she was the medical officer, and whatever was below that hatch needed the medical officer before it needed an operator. The ladder had 7 rungs. The subfloor space smelled of concrete and cold and something acrid she identified as a chemical toilet. She clicked on her small tactical light. 5 people. 2 adults seated against the far wall. 2 more adults near the center, one of them with what she could see from 6 feet was a shoulder injury. Wrong angle to the arm, holding it against the body with the careful immobility of someone in serious pain. The 5th was a girl, maybe 7, sitting between 2 of the adults, her face pressed into someone's side. She turned at the light and looked at Evelyn with eyes that had been in the dark long enough that they were huge. "It's okay," Evelyn said. She kept her voice completely level. Not a whisper, not a shout. A voice that said nothing had gone wrong. "I'm a nurse. We're going to get you out." The girl stared at her. Then she held out her arms, the way children do when they have been frightened for a long time, and finally see something they've decided to trust. Evelyn crossed the room in 3 steps and picked her up. Getting 5 people up a ladder, through a building, and back through the utility corridor with a wounded adult and a child was not fast. It was also not quiet. They were 12 minutes into the extraction when the radio in Colton's ear crackled and his face changed in a way that told her everything before he said a word. "We have movement on the south perimeter," he said. "Low, direct, no performance. Multiple contacts. They're doing a sweep pattern, which means it's not random. Someone triggered an alert. Or they do this every 4 hours and we happen to hit their window." He looked at her. "Either way, they're going to sweep around to the north in approximately 8 minutes, and when they don't find anything, they're going to pull back, or they're going to change the pattern and come toward the utility side. Which gives us either 8 minutes or 3. "Yeah." She had the girl on her back. Not a carry position she'd have chosen, but the child had locked her arms around Evelyn's neck and was not releasing, and there was no time to renegotiate. The adult with the shoulder injury was between two operators, moving slowly, face gray with pain that he was managing with the tight-jawed effort of someone who understood the stakes of making noise. "We move now," she said. "The wounded will move faster than you think if we help him correctly." She looked at the two operators supporting the man. "Switch grips. The current carry is loading the shoulder. Take him from the right side, both of you. Keep his left arm completely immobile." They switched. The man's breathing changed, still painful, not as bad. They moved. The corridor back through the compound was darker than their entry because the pre-dawn light had shifted, clouds moving in. Breck ran close, almost under her feet, aware that something had changed, recalibrating. The girl on Evelyn's back had gone completely still, the way children do when they understand instinctively that stillness is the correct response. 15 meters to the utility door. 10. Then Perez, at the rear of the column, said very quietly, "Contact right." Everyone froze. Breck heard it before any of them did, which was the only reason they had 2 seconds of warning before the guard rounded the corner at the far end of the machinery bay. The guard had a flashlight, not a weapon in hand, which meant he was on a sweep and not a contact mission. The flashlight was still moving. He hadn't focused it yet. The column was against the wall in the shadow of a machinery column, and the child on Evelyn's back had not made a sound. Breck was completely, utterly still. The flashlight swept left, swept right, paused on the machinery column. The light sat there for a moment that felt architectural, load-bearing, capable of crushing everything beneath it. Evelyn counted heartbeats. The light moved on. The guard walked back the way he'd come. Nobody breathed for another 8 seconds. Then Colton's hand came forward. Move, and they moved. Through the utility door, into the corridor, across the compound perimeter, into the brush. They were 30 meters from the drainage ravine when the alarm went off inside the compound behind them. Not sirens. A bell. Mechanical, loud, immediate. The kind of alarm that means someone opened something they shouldn't have or found something missing. The sound traveled through the cold air and landed on all of them like a hand between the shoulder blades. "Go," Evelyn said. Unnecessary. Everyone was already moving, but she said it anyway because her voice was steady, and sometimes a steady voice was the only thing that held a moving line together. The ravine was ahead, cold water. The girl tightened her arms. They hit the water, and behind them, through the trees, she could hear voices, 2, maybe 3, and the sound of something crashing through brush at a speed that meant someone was not being careful about noise because they didn't need to be careful anymore. They were in the water, 6 feet deep at center. The wounded man made a sound she would not repeat. One of the dogs, not Breck, one of the others, struggled against the current, and Okafor had to catch it with one arm, slowing them both. The far bank. Mud. Hands reaching. Evelyn got the girl up first, then climbed herself, felt her knee hit a rock in a way that sent a hot pulse up her thigh that she filed away because there was no current version of events where a bruised knee mattered. She was up. She pulled. The whole column cleared the bank. They ran. Behind them, the voices reached the ravine, a shout, then a second shout, louder, with a different quality. Not pursuit anymore, but reporting, calling back the sound of people who had found evidence of something and were escalating upward, which meant in approximately 6 minutes, someone with more resources and more authority was going to make a decision. And the exfiltration route they'd planned had one more problem that she had known about since 0200 and had not wanted to think about because there was no good answer to it. She'd built the route assuming they would exit via the North Service Road, which connected to a secondary highway where Tao's office had a vehicle team standing by. The North Service Road crossed a half-mile stretch of open terrain. She'd had thermal imaging on that stretch as of 1800 yesterday. She did not have thermal imaging on it now. And if Drake had made calls, if someone in his network had passed location intelligence to the people in that compound, which was exactly the kind of thing that happened when the wrong person knew too much, then the open terrain might not be empty. Colton came up beside her, breathing hard, scanning ahead. "North Road," he said. "Possible compromise," she said. "I don't know." He looked at her. "Percentage?" She thought about Drake's call, about the timeline. about what a man who had already filed a preemptive complaint was capable of doing when he realized it hadn't been enough. "I don't know," she said again, "but I don't like it." "Alternative?" She had been running alternatives since 0200. There was one. It was not better than the North Road in any normal sense. It was longer, harder, exposed to a different kind of risk. But it did not cross open terrain, which meant that whatever was or wasn't waiting on the North Service Road became irrelevant. She opened her mouth to tell him. Her radio crackled. Not Tao's channel. The general coordination frequency that their team had been given as a secondary contact. A voice she did not recognize said, "Kelman Element, hold your position. You have hostiles ahead on the North Road. Repeat, North Road is compromised. Do not proceed." Colton looked at her. "Who is that?" Ortega said from 3 feet behind them. She didn't know. The frequency was correct. The voice had the flat, compressed quality of someone speaking from a vehicle under stress. But she didn't know the voice, and she didn't know who had that channel outside their own unit in Tao's office. And they were standing in open ground with 5 civilians, 6 dogs, and voices behind them at the ravine that were getting organized. The girl on her back had started to shake. She made the call in under 4 seconds. Not because she was certain, she wasn't, but because standing still in open ground with voices organizing behind her and an unknown contact on the radio was worse than moving on incomplete information. And she had spent enough time in situations where the choice was between bad and worse to know that worse almost always came with delay. "East route," she said. "We talked about it at 0200. We're taking it." Colton didn't hesitate. "Ortega, left flank. Vasquez, rear. Move." The east route was longer by a quarter mile and crossed a timber access road that wasn't on the official maps because it predated the current property survey by 20 years. She'd found it in an archived land registry record at 0200 when she couldn't sleep and was running alternatives. It didn't connect to the highway. It connected to a secondary forestry depot that Tao's vehicle team could reach from a different direction in approximately 18 minutes if they moved the moment she sent the signal. She sent the signals while she ran. One-handed, the girl's weight shifting with every stride, her knee sending a consistent complaint up her leg that she deprioritized with the focused efficiency of someone who'd learned to do exactly that. Decker ran beside her with Breck between them. The dog's stride was steady, efficient. He wasn't wasting energy, which meant he wasn't spooked, which meant there was nothing immediately behind them close enough for him to fix on. She took that as information. The timber road came up through the tree line at 11 minutes, a rutted track, barely visible, with old gravel packed hard enough to hold their weight without sinking. She turned them onto it and did a quick count. All 14, 12 team members, 5 civilians, all present. The man with the shoulder was deteriorating. She could see it in the way he moved, the careful, compensating shuffle of someone whose pain management was failing. She needed to assess the injury properly, and she couldn't do it running through a forest. 2 minutes, she told the operator supporting him. "When we hit that clearing ahead, we stop for 2 minutes. We do if we want him mobile for the last quarter mile. Otherwise you carry him, and then we lose 6 minutes instead of 2. They stopped at the clearing. She had his jacket off in 40 seconds. The shoulder was dislocated, not fractured. She could feel the head of the humerus sitting wrong, displaced anteriorly, but the joint was intact underneath. A bad dislocation. Painful enough to be incapacitating if left. Manageable enough to correct in the field if you knew what you were doing, and the patient could hold still for 15 seconds. "This is going to hurt," she told him. His name was Harlan. One of the other hostages had used it in the subfloor space. "I need you to breathe out when I tell you to, and don't fight me." "How bad?" 15 seconds of very bad. Then better. He nodded. His jaw was set and his eyes were focused on something above her head. The trees, the sky, anything that wasn't her hands. She repositioned his arm, applied controlled traction, and rotated. He made a sound that he'd clearly decided beforehand to keep quiet, and it was quiet, barely. And then the joint moved, and she felt it seat, and he exhaled like something had released a valve in his chest. "Done," she said. He blinked, tested the arm carefully, a small movement. Yeah. Okay. Keep it against your body. Don't reach with it. 2 minutes and 14 seconds total. She'd taken 14 seconds longer than she'd said. They moved. The forestry depot appeared through the trees at 0623, gray light, the structure a corrugated metal building surrounded by equipment storage and 2 idle vehicles. Tao's team was already there, a dark SUV and a covered truck, 3 people in civilian clothes who were clearly not civilian, standing with the posture of people who had been waiting while trying not to look like they were waiting. Getting 14 people and 6 dogs into 2 vehicles was not elegant. It was also not quiet. The dogs were managing their energy carefully by now, the way trained animals did after sustained exertion, controlled but close enough to their limits that they needed handling. The girl had not let go of Evelyn since the subfloor space. One of Tao's team, a woman who introduced herself only as Torres, checked each civilian quickly, took photographs, asked 3 questions each. Evelyn watched the process and understood what it was: establishing condition of rescue, documenting state of the hostages at the point of extraction, chain of custody for bodies, evidence preservation. Drake had filed a complaint. Tao was building a counter-record. "Are we going to Kelman Ridge, Bex?" Colton asked Torres. "No." Torres was already moving toward the SUV. "Federal Processing Facility in Harwick. Colonel Tao will meet you there." Colton looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him and didn't say what she was thinking, which was that going to Harwick meant they were under Tao's operational umbrella now, not Fitch's, not regional commands, and definitely not Drake's. The complaint Drake had filed was designed to intercept them at Kelman Ridge, where the personnel chain gave him leverage. Harwick removed that leverage entirely. "Good," she said. The facility in Harwick was a federal building that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable office complex. Low profile, no signage beyond a street number, parking lot with a gate that required a card. Inside it was warm and smelled of institutional cleaning product and stale coffee, which was the smell of every legitimate operation she'd ever been part of, and she found it deeply reassuring. Colonel Miriam Tao was waiting in the main briefing room. She was smaller than Evelyn had imagined from the voice, compact and still, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had spent decades not showing things. She looked at Evelyn when they brought the team in, and the look was brief and thorough and said, without words, that she had read everything there was to read about the person standing in front of her. "Nurse Marsh," she said. "Colonel. The hostages are being processed. The child is with a pediatric medical officer." She paused. She asked where you were. Something small and complicated moved through Evelyn's chest. She didn't respond to it. "What's the status on Drake?" Tao's expression didn't change, which was itself an answer of a kind. "Sit down, both of you." She meant Evelyn and Colton. They sat. Drake's complaint was received by my office's counterpart in the Regional Personnel Division at 1935 last night. By 2200, he had also contacted 2 members of the Joint Operational Review Committee and a senior official in the department's General Counsel office. He's been building a case. The formal language is unauthorized tactical mobilization, misappropriation of military assets, and this is the new addition this morning, endangerment of civilian hostages by conducting an unsanctioned rescue operation. Colton's jaw tightened. Endangerment. He's claiming that the operation put the hostages at greater risk than a sanctioned response would have. Tao's voice was flat. It's a legal argument, not a tactical one. Its purpose is to shift the frame of inquiry from why the authorization was delayed to whether the operation itself was appropriate. That's... Colton stopped himself. "It's smart," Evelyn said. Both of them looked at her. If the inquiry is about the delay, the question becomes why Drake's office sat on the flag for 50 hours. If the inquiry is about our operation, the question becomes whether we had authorization. He's trying to redirect. "Yes," Tao said. "Can he make it stick?" Tao looked at her with something that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it. "That depends on what the documentation shows, which is why I need you to walk me through everything you found. The routing log, the procurement thread, the metadata, in the presence of 2 investigators on the record starting in approximately 20 minutes. Okay. This will be used in a formal federal review. Anything you say will become part of that record. I understand. The connection you identified between Drake's contracting network and the location, do you stand behind that assessment? She thought about the words 60 to 70% that she'd used on the phone yesterday morning. A lot had happened since then, and none of it had changed the underlying data. What had changed was that they had extracted 5 living people from that location, which meant the location was real, the situation had been real, and the delay had been real. Yes, she said. Tao nodded once. Then let's get started. The debriefing lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. She talked until her throat was dry, and then she kept talking. The 2 investigators asked good questions, specific, referenced, not trying to lead her, but genuinely following the thread. She laid out everything in sequence, how she'd accessed the routing log, how she'd followed the procurement connection, what the metadata in Drake's office had shown, and how she'd concluded that the delay was deliberate rather than procedural. She cited every document by its reference number. She flagged the 2 places where her assessment was correlative rather than proven, and explained why she'd drawn the conclusion she had anyway. When she finished, one of the investigators, a quiet man named Reyes, who'd spent most of the session writing, looked up. The procurement thread. You said you were 60 to 70% on it. Yes. Our financial forensics team ran the connection this morning, independently, after Colonel Tao briefed them. He paused. They're at 92%. They found an additional intermediary layer you didn't have access to. The room was quiet. There's more, Reyes said, and something in his tone shifted. Not excitement, but the specific quality of a person about to say something that had weight. The private security network that connects to that location. 2 of its senior officers have prior documented relationships with Drake's office going back 7 years. Not just contracting relationships, personal financial relationships, offshore account structures. She looked at Tao. Tao looked back at her steadily. He wasn't protecting a procurement line, Evelyn said. No, Tao said. He was protecting himself. Is said, what happened next moved faster than she expected, and she had learned to expect things to move faster than she expected. The formal review request went to the department's inspector general at 1400 hours, 6 hours after they'd arrived at Harwick. By 1600, Drake had been notified that his authority to take any action related to the Delta-7 extraction or the personnel involved was suspended pending review. The notification was delivered by a federal officer, in person, at Drake's office in the regional headquarters building. The kind of delivery that couldn't be quietly set aside or administratively delayed. She heard about it from Colton, who heard about it from Torres, who had apparently been briefed in real time. He tried to argue it, Colton told her. They were in a side corridor at Harwick, both of them against the wall, both of them running on the specific exhausted clarity of people who had been awake for most of the past 30 hours. The officer who delivered the notification. Drake said the review was procedurally premature and asked for his counsel to be present before any restrictions were applied. What did the officer say? That the restrictions were already applied and the presence of counsel at a future hearing was his right, but that future hearing was distinct from the current notification. He paused. Apparently Drake's deputy was in the room and didn't say a word the entire time. Evelyn filed that. A deputy who stayed quiet when their director was fighting a federal notification was a deputy who had made a calculation about which way this was going. Tao's going to call you back in, Colton said. Probably an hour. There's something she wants to put in front of you before the review board convenes. What is it? He shook his head. She didn't say, but Torres said to make sure you'd eaten something first. She looked at him. That's ominous. Yeah. He pushed off the wall. There's coffee and some food in the second room on the left. Actual food, not vending machine. He started down the corridor, then stopped, half-turned. For what it's worth, the thing you said to me in the aid station, that you'd been in situations where the thing in front of you was the least dangerous thing in the room. Yes. I think I believe you now. He walked away. Tao's second briefing was shorter, and the quality of its contents was different in a way she could feel before Tao finished the first sentence. Drake filed an addendum to his complaint 2 hours ago, Tao said, personally authored, not through counsel. He submitted it directly to the Joint Operational Review Committee. What's in it? Tao set a document on the table between them. He's alleging that you used your classified service record to access channels and coordinate activities that exceeded not just your civilian contract authority, but your reinstated emergency clearance. His argument is that the emergency adjunct status I authorized was itself improper, because your underlying service record, the one that supports the clearance, was never formally transferred to civilian reserve status. He's saying there's a procedural gap in your credentialing that makes everything you did unauthorized, retroactively. She looked at the document. Is there a gap? She asked. There is a documentation irregularity. Tao's voice was precise. When you left the service, the standard transfer protocol creates a civilian reserve record. Yours was created, but it was not fully executed. One signature was missing from the final document. It's almost certainly a clerical omission, but almost certainly isn't the same as provably, and Drake's legal team has found it. He's going to use it to argue that the clearance I used was invalid. Yes. And if the clearance was invalid, the authorization for the operation falls apart, and the operation itself becomes unsanctioned, she said. The word sat there. Tao said nothing. Evelyn looked at the document for a long moment. She thought about the subfloor space, the 5 people in the dark, the girl's arms locking around her neck. She thought about the timing, 50 hours of an authorization flag sitting untouched, and the hours she'd sat in the aid station hoping someone else was solving it, and the decision she'd made to stop hoping. The missing signature, she said. Whose was it? The outgoing records officer for your unit at the time of your separation. Standard practice was for that officer to countersign the reserve transfer document. Who was the outgoing records officer? Tao glanced at the folder in front of her. Captain Alan Doss? She felt something move in her memory. Not a clear image, more like the shape of one. Doss. The name sat in the back of her mind, familiar in the way of someone you'd seen at a distance rather than known directly. Is Doss still active? He retired 14 months ago. He's located in... Tao checked again. He's in Meridian, Oregon. Would a retroactive countersignature resolve the irregularity? Tao looked at her. Really looked at her, the way people did when they were deciding whether the person across from them had a capacity they hadn't credited. If Captain Doss could be located and would provide a countersignature on the original transfer document with a notarized explanation of the clerical omission at time of separation, it would close the procedural gap. She paused. Drake's legal team knows this. They filed the addendum before close of business today, which means the earliest a countersignature could be obtained and entered into the record would be tomorrow morning, Evelyn said. The Joint Operational Review Committee convenes at 0800 tomorrow. If the countersignature isn't in the record before 0800, then Drake's addendum stands uncontested. The room was very quiet. Tao leaned forward slightly. Captain Doss would need to be contacted, willing to cooperate and physically present at a notary before business closed today. It's... She stopped. Possible? Evelyn said. Technically. But Drake's legal team would have anticipated this. If they filed this afternoon, knowing the counter is a Doss signature, they may have taken steps to make Captain Doss difficult to reach. The air in the room changed texture slightly. What kind of steps? Evelyn asked. Tao's expression was the most careful she'd seen it. 2 hours ago, Captain Doss's listed phone number was disconnected. His home address in Meridian shows no current occupant according to our field check. His email address bounced. She paused. He appears to have become very hard to find in the last 4 hours. Evelyn set both hands flat on the table. Drake has someone running interference on Doss, she said. I can't prove that yet. But you think it. Tao said nothing, which was the most honest answer available. Evelyn looked at the wall, thought about Doss, about a man she had a shape of in her memory rather than a face, about a signature that should have happened 4 years ago and hadn't, because somewhere in the bureaucratic mechanics of her separation, someone had missed a step. One small missed step that had been invisible and harmless for 4 years, and was now the lever Drake's team was using to try to pull down everything she'd built in the past 48 hours. She thought about the child, about the drawing of a dog that she hadn't seen yet, but somehow already knew the shape of. What's my timeline? She said. The committee convenes at 0800. You would need the counter-signature filed with the record by 7:45 to allow for processing. Tao looked at the clock on the wall. It was 17:14. 14 hours and 31 minutes. To find a man Drake's team has been actively hiding for 4 hours. Yes, she exhaled. Not a sigh. Something more controlled than that. A reset. The kind she'd learned to do in the field when the situation changed in a way that the plan hadn't accounted for, and the plan therefore needed to change with it. I need a phone, she said, and whatever search access your office has for current locations. Tao slid both across the table. Evelyn picked up the phone. She had a number she hadn't used in 3 years. The number of a man who'd worked with her unit in her third rotation, and who had, in the way of people who worked in specific overlapping worlds, connections that went sideways through channels that didn't appear on any organizational chart. She didn't know if it still worked. She didn't know if he was still reachable. She dialed. 4 rings. Then a voice she recognized, rough and slightly guarded, the way voices always were with unknown numbers. Yeah. It's Evelyn Marsh, she said. I need to find someone, and I need to find them fast, and I think whoever is hiding them has had a 4-hour head start. Do you still know people who can run that down? A pause. Then, Marsh, I heard you were doing something medical somewhere boring. It got less boring. Yeah. The voice changed slightly, something coming alive in it that she recognized as the sound of someone whose particular set of skills had just become relevant. Give me the name. She gave him the name. Timeline? 14 hours. Closer to 13 now. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Okay. Give me an hour. Don't go anywhere. The line clicked. She set the phone down. Tao was watching her. Who was that? Someone who owes me, Evelyn said. Then honestly, someone I did a difficult thing for once, in a difficult place. And who is the kind of person who doesn't forget that? Is he reliable? She thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved. In my experience, yes. In general, I don't know. But in the category of finding people who have been deliberately hidden in the last 4 hours by someone who expected not to be challenged, she looked at Tao. He's the best option I have. Tao accepted that. The clock on the wall read 17:19, 13 hours and 41 minutes. Somewhere in whatever version of organ shelter or contingency plan Drake's people had pointed him toward, a retired records officer named Doss was sitting with a disconnected phone number and no idea that a woman who'd left the service 4 years ago without a completed signature on her transfer document was currently the most motivated person in the country to find him. And somewhere in a federal building in the same city, Director Calvin Drake was sitting with his counsel and his addendum and his careful offensive strategy, and he was confident. She could feel the shape of his confidence from here, the kind that came from a man who had controlled these variables long enough to trust his control, that he had won. He did not know about the phone call she'd just made. He did not know about the man on the other end of it. And he did not know, could not know, because nobody had told him, because she hadn't known herself until she was standing in the subfloor space in the dark with 5 people who'd been waiting for someone to come, that the thing Drake had treated as a bureaucratic irregularity, a clerical gap, a quiet lever, was the same kind of problem she had been solving her entire professional life. Not the clean kind, not the kind with resources, the kind where you had the wrong tools, the wrong timeline, and no margin, and you solved it anyway. The clock ticked. She picked up the phone again and started working. The first hour produced nothing useful. The contact, whose name she had never used in the 3 years she'd known him and didn't use now because that was part of how that world worked, came back at the 54-minute mark with a location in Grants Pass that had already gone cold. Someone had checked Doss into a motel under a variation of his name, paid cash, and checked him out again within 90 minutes. The trail was real. It was also 4 hours old, which meant whoever was managing Doss had anticipated exactly this kind of search and built in a relay point. He's being moved, she told Tao. This isn't Doss hiding on his own. Someone is physically relocating him. Drake's people have resources. Yes, but moving someone physically takes time and manpower, and it creates a trail even when you're trying not to. She looked at the location data on the screen. Grants Pass. If you were moving someone from there and you wanted them unreachable in southern Oregon, you had limited directions. North was too exposed, too many populated routes. East went into high desert that was impossible to disappear into quickly without specialized knowledge. South was the California border, which created federal jurisdiction complications that would actually work against a cover operation. West, she said. The coast? Coast towns. Small, off-season, cash economy. If I were moving someone and I wanted them to stay dark for 12 hours specifically, I'd put them somewhere they could walk to food and not be noticed. She pulled up a map. Bandon, Coos Bay, Brookings. One of those three. That's a 2-hour drive from Grants Pass, which means they're already there, or almost. She gave the contact the 3 locations. He said 14 minutes and hung up. It took 11. Brookings. A vacation rental on a bluff road that backed up to a state forest, registered under a shell name that the contact had punched through in minutes using a method she didn't ask about. 1 vehicle in the driveway. No lights, which meant either empty or occupied by someone who'd been told to stay dark. I need someone in Brookings who can make contact, she told Tao. Not law enforcement. If Drake's people see a marked vehicle, they'll move Doss again and we won't find him twice. Tao was already on a second phone. She spoke quietly and precisely, the way she did everything, and Evelyn listened to the half of it she could hear and understood that Tao had people in positions she hadn't known about, which made sense for someone in her role. 17 minutes later, a name and a contact number appeared on the screen in front of her, an investigative field officer named Pratt, who was currently in Medford, 40 minutes from Brookings. She called Pratt directly. I need you to make contact with a retired officer named Alan Doss at this address. He doesn't know why he's there. He may have been told things about the situation that aren't accurate. You need to explain who I am, what I need, and why it matters. She paused. And you need to do it in a way that doesn't panic him, because if he panics, he won't sign anything. What if the people managing him are still on site? Then you're polite, you explain you're following up on a federal documentation matter, and you ask to speak with Captain Doss directly. You don't push. You don't identify the investigation. You give him a phone so he can talk to me. That's a soft approach. He's a retired records officer who signed a lot of papers over 20 years and probably didn't think any of them would ever matter this much. He doesn't need to be confronted. He needs to understand what happened and decide for himself. She stopped. Then, he's not the problem. He's the solution. Treat him accordingly. Pratt left for Brookings. Tao looked at her across the table. You think he'll cooperate. I think he missed a signature 4 years ago and has probably never thought about it since. I think when someone explains that the missing signature is currently being used to argue that 5 people should have been left in a subfloor space, he'll want to fix it. She paused. Most people aren't villains. They're just people who didn't know their small omissions had a long reach. Pratt called back at 2211. She had Alan Doss on the line at 2214. His voice was older than she'd expected and careful. The careful of someone who'd been told conflicting things by different people in the past several hours and didn't know which version to believe yet. They told me I needed to stay out of contact for a few days, Doss said. Something about a personnel review that might need a statement from me. I should have asked more questions. You're not in trouble, she said. The review is real, but you're not the subject of it. They said, the people who brought me here, they said that if I made contact with federal investigators, it could complicate things for someone who'd served honorably. Did they tell you who that someone was? A pause. No. It's me, she said. I was in the unit you processed separation records for in 2021. My transfer document was missing a countersignature, yours specifically. That omission is now being used in a federal review to argue that a rescue operation that brought 5 people home was unauthorized. Silence on the line. A long silence. I missed a signature on your file, Doss said. Not a question. Yes. And someone is using that to... Yes. Another silence. She let it sit because Doss needed to arrive at his decision without being pushed, and the space to think was the most respectful thing she could give him. I remember the separation period, he said finally. We had a backlog. I was processing 47 files in 2 weeks. I don't remember yours specifically, but he stopped. If I missed it, that's on me. That's a record I should have completed. It was a clerical omission. It happens. Not in my section it didn't, not supposed to. His voice had shifted, less careful now, something more resolved underneath it. What do you need? A countersignature on the original transfer document, notarized with an explanatory note about the clerical omission at time of separation. Agent Pratt can facilitate the notarization tonight if you're willing. Tonight. The review committee convenes at 0800. I need it in the record by 0745. He did the math. That's less than 10 hours from now. Yes. The silence this time was shorter. Put Pratt back on, Doss said. Let's figure out where the nearest notary is. She exhaled. Not dramatically, just a slow, quiet release, the kind that the body needed and she hadn't given it permission for in the past several hours. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me. I should have signed it right the first time. He paused. Did you get them out? The 5 people? Yes? All of them? All of them, including the child. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it she recognized. Not pride, not relief exactly, but the specific quality of a person who understood that a thing they'd done, or failed to do, had mattered in a way that extended far beyond themselves. All right, he said. Let's get it done. The document arrived in Tao's secure record system at 0631. Notarized, countersigned, with a 3-paragraph explanatory statement from Captain Alan Doss, retired, detailing the backlog conditions of his office in the relevant period and confirming the omission as clerical in nature. It was exactly what it needed to be. Nothing more, nothing less, no legal overreach. She was asleep in a chair in the Harwick facility's side room when Tao's aide knocked and told her. She had not meant to sleep. She'd sat down at 0300 with a cup of coffee and the intention of staying awake, and her body had made a different decision without consulting her, which was the body's prerogative when it had been running on adrenaline and inadequate food for 36 hours. She sat up. Her knee ached. Her neck ached worse. It's in the record, she said. Filed at 0631, confirmed received at 0638. The aide, a young man whose name she hadn't caught, looked like he'd also had a difficult night. Colonel Tao wanted you to know immediately. She looked at the clock. 6:41. 1 hour and 4 minutes before the committee convened. She stood, worked her neck until something shifted, drank the cold remains of the coffee that had been sitting beside her, and went to find a mirror. But the Joint Operational Review Committee convened in a larger room than she'd expected. Not an auditorium, but a formal conference space with a long table and a seating arrangement that indicated hierarchy clearly. Tao sat on one side. Drake's legal team sat on the other. Drake himself was not present, which she understood immediately. His counsel had advised him not to attend because a man who was a potential subject of a federal investigation sat behind his lawyers, not in front of a committee. His absence said more than his presence would have. She sat next to Tao. Colton sat 2 seats down. Decker was there, which surprised her until she saw that he'd been called as a witness for the operational record. Ortega was at the far end of the table, in his dress uniform, with the particular posture of someone who had decided that the best thing he could do was sit correctly and let the facts do the work. The committee chair was a brigadier general named Hargrove. She didn't know him, but Tao had given her a 60-second summary on the walk to the room. He had a reputation for patience and a known institutional allergy to cases where the paperwork had been manipulated to produce a predetermined outcome. She filed that as the most relevant thing about him. Hargrove opened the session. The clerk read the complaint and addendum into the record. Drake's lead counsel, a polished, calm-voiced man named Ebert, was given the opportunity to present the procedural argument. Ebert was good. She gave him that. He built the argument in clean layers: the civilian contract scope, the clearance gap, the authorization chain, the operational overreach. He didn't overstate it. He didn't accuse her of anything that wasn't already in the filed documents. He simply, methodically, laid out a case in which every action she had taken was technically unauthorized because the underlying clearance was procedurally void. It took him 22 minutes. Hargrove looked at Tao. Response. Tao stood. She had known Tao was formidable from the first phone call. She had not fully understood, until this moment, how formidable. Tao dismantled Ebert's argument in 12 minutes, and she did it with the same methodical patience he'd used to build it. Layer by layer, document by document, the countersignature that had arrived at 0631, the emergency adjunct authorization that had predated Drake's complaint, the procurement thread and the financial forensic analysis that was now at 92% confidence. And she paused here, and the pause had weight. The offshore account structures connecting Drake personally to the network that had held 5 people in a subfloor space for 61 hours. Drake's counsel tried to object. Hargrove let him finish the sentence, then said very quietly that the financial documentation had been submitted to the record by DCIC at 0720 and was part of the current proceeding. Ebert looked at his notes, looked at the document reference, looked at his second chair, who was already reading something on a tablet with an expression that showed the effort of not showing an expression. The offshore account structures were not in the complaint Ebert had been given to argue. They were new, and they were not operational overreach. They were personal financial exposure, which was an entirely different legal category and one that Drake's counsel had not been briefed to counter because Drake had not told his counsel they existed. The committee took a 40-minute recess. When it reconvened, Hargrove set a piece of paper on the table and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. The procedural complaint against Nurse Evelyn Marsh is dismissed in its entirety. He said it the way he said everything, with patience and without drama. The countersignature documentation resolves the clearance irregularity, and the emergency adjunct authorization from DCIC establishes proper authority for all operational activities. There are no grounds for contract action. He looked at Tao. The financial documentation submitted by DCIC this morning will be referred to the department's Inspector General for formal review, in conjunction with the procurement thread already under analysis. He paused. Director Drake is placed on administrative leave pending completion of that review. He is to have no contact with any personnel, documentation, or operational process related to the Delta 7 extraction or any associated investigation. Ebert was already writing. His face was composed in the way that faces were composed when the body underneath had absorbed something and decided to process it later. Hargrove closed the folder in front of him. "We're adjourned." The room moved. Chairs, voices, the shuffle of people reassembling their composure in the aftermath of a proceeding that had ended differently than at least one party had planned. Colton appeared at her shoulder. She didn't turn immediately. She sat there for a moment and let the room be loud around her, let the specific, strange stillness of a thing being over settle into her chest. She hadn't let herself think about over. She'd been so focused on each next step, each next problem, each next name on a list, that she hadn't actually permitted herself the thought that there was going to be a point where it stopped. It had stopped. "Marsh," Colton said. She turned. He looked like she felt, exhausted, slightly disoriented, and underneath that, something that had been under pressure for a long time, releasing in increments. He had a difficult face to read under normal circumstances. Right now, it was not difficult at all. "We're not even," he said. "I know that. What I did, the way I treated you at Kelman Ridge, Lieutenant." "Colton," he said. "Ryan." She looked at him. "We're not even," she agreed. "But we're square. There's a difference." He thought about that. Nodded once, the specific kind of nod that meant something was being filed away. "Square," he said. Decker found her near the door. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside her, and that was accurate because there was nothing that needed saying between people who'd crossed a drainage ravine at 0500 and come out the other side. The formal consequences for Drake unfolded over the following 6 weeks, and they were neither swift nor cinematic, which was how justice actually worked when it worked correctly. Slowly, documented, with the particular grinding thoroughness of institutional accountability doing what it was designed to do. The Inspector General's review opened within 48 hours of the committee proceeding. The financial forensic team's analysis, combined with the procurement thread Evelyn had sourced and the offshore account structures Tao's office had surfaced, built a case that expanded as it went, one thread pulling another, the way these things did when the core structure was rotten enough. By the end of the second week, the investigation had reached beyond Drake's immediate office into two related contracting firms and a procurement officer who had been operating as an intermediary for 7 years. Drake resigned his directorship on a Thursday morning through counsel without a statement. The resignation was formally accepted, and his security clearances were suspended the same day. The federal investigation did not end with the resignation. It couldn't, because the investigation was about the conduct, not the position. But it moved out of the operational arena and into the legal one, which was where it belonged. She heard about the resignation from Tao via a brief call that Tao ended in under 3 minutes, because Tao was not a person who lingered. She was back at Kelman Ridge when it happened. She had returned 3 days after the committee proceeding because her contract still ran, the aid station still needed running, and she was not the kind of person who left things undone because the dramatic moment had passed. The first week back had been strange. The compound had the texture of a place where something significant had happened just off screen. People knew the broad outlines, and the broad outlines had moved through the unit the way information always moved in a closed installation, through proximity and implication rather than direct communication. Nobody said anything to her directly. But things were different in the specific daily ways that mattered. Colton's unit said her name in group settings. The senior handlers checked in with her voluntarily rather than waiting for her to come to them. Even Strand, who had spent 11 weeks being careful and neutral, came by the aid station with a formal request to review and expand the K9 medical protocol documentation, and stayed 20 minutes longer than the review required to talk about the implications for the broader installation. The formal recognition came at the end of the third week in the form of a letter from the department's secretary, which arrived in Colonel Fitch's office, and which Fitch hand-delivered to the aid station himself. He stood in the doorway while she read it, which she appreciated because it meant he wasn't watching her face. The letter cleared the record. Officially, fully, with language that had been written by people who chose words carefully. It commended the operation, commended the K9 unit, commended the coordination with DCIC. It did not use the word hero, which she was glad about, because hero was a word that belonged to the distance between what a situation required and what a person was able to give. And that distance was different for everyone who'd been in that ravine, and a single word flattened something that deserved to be complicated. Fitch took the letter back when she was done. "This goes in your official file," he said, "permanently." "Yes, sir." He started to leave. Stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, not quite looking at her, "the manner in which you handled the routing access, the way you moved through the chain, you could have gone faster. You could have made more noise." He paused. "You didn't. It wasn't about making noise." "No." He looked at her then, just briefly. "That's exactly what I mean." He left. Breck was at her feet. He'd been allowed into the aid station 3 times this week. Decker pretended not to notice, and Evelyn pretended the relevant protocol didn't specifically exclude working dogs from medical facilities. Neither of them said anything about it. She reached down and put her hand on his head. The scar on his muzzle was a familiar shape under her fingers by now. He pressed into the touch the way he always did. The K9 program received full operational funding 6 weeks after the committee proceeding, as part of a departmental review that Tao's office had quietly initiated alongside the Drake investigation. The connection was not stated in the public documentation. It didn't need to be. The review found that the program had been systematically underfunded and understaffed for 3 budget cycles, and the finding recommended immediate correction. Decker's title changed. Okafor and Perez were formally promoted. 3 new handlers were assigned to Kelman Ridge, and the program expanded to include a medical integration component, formalized, documented, with a protocol that ran 8 pages and bore Evelyn's name in the attribution line. She had not written it alone. She'd written it with Decker, which was the right way to do it, because she understood the medicine and he understood the dogs, and the intersection of those 2 things was where the real work lived. Colton became the senior instructor for a new cross-training initiative between the K9 unit and the standard infantry rotations. His first session included a module he'd written himself, which she saw excerpted in the training materials Ortega left on her desk one morning without comment. The module was titled Operational Trust and Non-Hierarchical Assessment, and the first paragraph said, in plain language, that rank told you where a person stood in a formal structure and nothing else. and that the most dangerous assumption any operator could make was that expertise stopped at the edge of their own job title. She read it twice. Then she set it down and went back to work. The drawing arrived on a Tuesday. A padded envelope, no return address, postmarked from a city she didn't recognize in Northern California. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice, on which a child had drawn in crayon and colored pencil, with the focused, serious effort of someone who had something specific to say. The dog in the drawing had a scar on its face. It was mostly brown with some orange that was probably meant to be gold. It was much larger than the people around it, because in children's drawings important things were big, and that was right. Beside the dog stood a woman with yellow hair. The woman was not particularly detailed, stick figure proportions, a circle for a head, 2 lines for arms. But she was holding the dog's leash, and the leash was drawn with care, a careful curving line connecting the two of them. Below the drawing, in the laborious capital letters of a child learning to write, were the words, "She came." That was all. No name, no explanation, no address. She sat with it for a long time. There was a thing that happened sometimes, not often, not reliably, but sometimes, in the space after something hard had ended. A moment where the distance between who you'd been at the start of it and who you were standing in the wreckage of its aftermath became briefly visible. Not as growth, not as transformation, not as any of the clean words people used for it. Just as distance, as a measure of how far you'd traveled and what you'd been carrying when you did. She had been a nurse in a military aid station, whom a lieutenant's unit called station, like furniture. She had been a woman in scrubs who walked across a training yard to tell a soldier to leave a dog alone and gotten laughed at for it. She had been 11 weeks of invisible work and 1 day of review and 4 hours of watching the right thing not happen and 58 hours of deciding to make it happen herself. She was still a nurse, still in the same aid station, still making the same coffee that still wasn't good enough, still watching Breck track across the north field at 0445 with Decker moving beside him in the pre-dawn dark, 2 figures who understood each other across a species barrier that had never really been about species. None of it was clean. The investigation into Drake's network would take 2 more years to fully resolve, and the outcome would be incomplete in the way that outcomes always were. Some accountability, some gaps, some edges that would never quite close. The 5 hostages were home, but home was not the same as healed, and healed was not a destination, but a direction. The girl who had drawn the picture would carry the subfloor space in her body for years, in ways that nobody could fully fix. And that was true. And it was important, and it didn't cancel the fact that she was home. Evelyn had a bruised knee that still ached in the rain. She had a classified file that was now slightly less classified, and a letter in her official record, and a K-9 protocol with her name in the attribution line, and a signature from a retired records officer who'd stayed up until 1 in the morning in Brookings, Oregon, to make sure a document was right. She had Breck, who pressed his head against her knee in the aid station and breathed slowly and didn't ask for anything she hadn't already given. And she had the drawing, which she pinned to the wall beside her desk. Not in a frame, not behind glass, just pinned at the corners with 4 pushpins, where she could see it when she was refilling the suture supplies or checking the cold weather protocol, or listening to the rain come in off the coast and waiting for the next thing to need fixing. She came. Not she was sent. Not they sent her. Not help arrived. She came. There was a difference, and the child who drew it knew the difference, and Evelyn knew it too, in the specific way you knew things that you'd learned with your whole body rather than just your mind. The world had a reliable tendency to look at the person in the room who seemed least likely to matter and treat that assessment as a fact. It had done it to her on a training yard in November, and it had done it in a review committee, and it had done it in every space where she'd been quiet, when quiet was the right instrument and moved when moving was the only option left. The world had a tendency to mistake stillness for absence, competence for arrogance, restraint for weakness. She had learned over a long time and in hard places that you didn't change that by announcing yourself. You changed it by doing the thing in front of you as well as it could be done, and letting the record speak when it was ready, and not requiring the room to validate you before you trusted your own read of what was necessary. That was the only version of strength she'd ever believed in. Not the kind that needed to be seen, the kind that kept moving whether or not anyone was watching. She looked at the drawing one more time. Then she got up, refilled her coffee, and went back to work.